While we were developing this evidence to counteract that, we hired doctors to testify for the parents. The doctor that we hired, an expert witness, he had a shortfall and he died during the case. So that was a setback. Still didn't change the position of the state's attorney and the guardian ad litem representing the children as to what should happen in the case. Eventually, the parents won their case. They got assessments of their parenting that were stellar. And the attorney for the children flipped to the side of the parents. And Tony eventually went back to work. He started working again with at-risk youth, but he had lost his position as the executive director in the agency he founded. Now, I use these stories to talk about generally why is this happening? And why is it so easy to weaponize these claims, even when they're false? Why has it become a system where we've effectively gone from innocent until proven guilty to guilty until proven innocent? And why are these stories so rarely told? We see a lot of media about the child who's beaten, the child who's starved, the child who's sexually abused, but we don't see stories about families who are wrongly accused. And I did have the experience of trying to get media attention to these stories. And in fact, in the long story that I tell in the book, I was actually on the phone while the child abuse investigators were at the home. I was on the phone in my office trying to get media attention to go out to film what was going on at the home. And we couldn't get it. We couldn't get media attention. And I think the reason was that the media wanted proof of innocence. They wanted proof of innocence, and we couldn't prove innocence at that time. The media didn't want to be on the wrong side of the story. So the stories of the innocent don't get told. By the time they were exonerated, it wasn't newsworthy anymore. You know, it wasn't a compelling visual case that they could report. So I think that this whole lack of media attention, the inability to show the other side, what's happening when families are innocent and where there's really no good reason to believe in the guilt narrative, like in Tony's case, the little girl was saying it was a fall. Why are we believing that the injury couldn't be from a fall? So this narrative just doesn't get told, and that in turn fuels the policies of ever more punitive responses, ever more dramatic and draconian responses. So now, another theme of my book is how the healthcare system has gotten kind of enmeshed in all of this. The healthcare system has gotten onto the wrong side. And I've heard that since I've been in New York, I've been in New York this week, I've heard very similar stories. And I've actually worked on one case in the appellate court in New York that was similar. We have a system where we've entrusted certain doctors called child abuse pediatricians to make the decisions about whether a child is abused or neglected. And these child abuse pediatricians often work on contract. They work closely with police and prosecutors, and they're the ones that the child protection system is listening to. Now, I don't particularly have a problem with doctors consulting with the state and giving an opinion about whether there's child abuse or child neglect. That's okay. I don't want it to be my doctor who's doing that. And in fact, what's happening is that people are going to doctors and giving them all their information. The doctors are representing themselves as members of the trauma team or the emergency room staff, and not telling the family that they also work for the state and that everything they're saying is going to the police and the prosecutor and the child protection investigator. I have a big problem with that. That should be deemed unethical and illegal, and in some, I've been working to make that the case. So there is a report that I worked on 4 years ago that lists all the ethical problems with the system. The lack of disclosure, interrogations of parents overnight without telling them what is happening with the information they're giving. Lack of consultation with other doctors, even though doctors are supposed to be treaters and not advocates. And failure to give respect the decision-making authority of the parents over their children, reporting to the state without sharing information with the parents, lack of consent. These are all issues that this system is rife with. I discussed some of those in the Atlantic article, so you don't have to read the whole book. You can, but there's more in the book about all of that. So I believe that the medical system has abdicated its responsibility. The press has abdicated their responsibility. The medical system has abdicated its responsibility to the families. And the injuries that are happening to these families are not well documented. We have assumed that when in doubt, we should be calling, we should be saying something, and people don't understand the effect of those calls on the families that are the targets. So in order to fix this system, I think we need to do many things. Part of the reason I wrote the book is just to raise awareness that this is really going on. But we have very relaxed burdens of proof, meaning that if you think if there's some evidence of abuse, there doesn't even have to be the majority of the evidence, just some evidence. That's enough in most states to put somebody's name in a child abuse register. That's unfair. That's wrong. In the court system, we have these assumptions that let the state take children on a preliminary basis and let the parents fight to get their children back. And under a burden of proof, then it's more likely than not, but all the cards are on the state side in proving the case. So that should change. We need to make legal counsel available to all parents who are facing proceedings like these. And that's not happening. In 13 states, there isn't a right to counsel in these cases. So these are just some of and then of course the ethical problems that I mentioned. These are some of the things that I'm advocating. So I welcome questions and discussion on all of this. And of course, happy to sign books if you purchase them and talk some more afterwards.
I don't have a question, but I witnessed a situation a number of years ago in a shopping mall, which a man was walking with a little boy, and all of a sudden the little boy blurted out, "No, I won't go with you. You're not my father." People came running over and started to beat up on this man, kick him. I mean, it was a bloody mess. Someone turned to the boy and said, "Do you know this man?" He said, "Yes, he's my grandfather." And they stopped beating him up, and the boy was just being difficult. He did not want to leave the mall. He wanted to play and what have you. So it was said. I didn't stay around for the upshot. I don't think the police were called.
Well, they could have been. Yeah. So that's one of the problems with laws that are see something, say something. You see this on the trains all over. See something, say something. I mean, I ask, see what, say what? I mean, what do you think you're seeing? What do you know is true? A lot of times, just like that example, it's a great one, where you don't know the backstory. And children who have disabilities, parents who have disabilities. I mean, one of the stories in the class action that I talk about in the book involves a boy who had sensory processing issues, and his father was told to tickle him. That he needed, some physical stimulation. And they're on the train. Somebody sees them the boy getting tickled. A hotline call gets made. and one of these separation threats is made. And all through the summer, the little boy could not go outside because his mother, who was told she had to watch the boy at all times, his father couldn't be alone with him, she was disabled herself. And she couldn't, so the boy didn't learn to ride his bike that summer just because this anonymous call got made. We never knew who made it, but that caused the whole disruption in the plan for the summer. Basically ruined the summer for this family, and potentially could have had more harm if it had been left on his record.
I want to thank you for coming out. Wonderful presentation, very insightful. I work for a grassroots organization called Power of Two. We do early childhood intervention. So I work in the field with children. I work with foster care cases. What we're finding is you make such a valid point when you speak about medical backgrounds and pre-existing conditions that are there that are misdiagnosed or aren't diagnosed at all. For example, autism. Right? I have one particular case that I'm working with right now, a family, there's this wonderful lady who's fostering a child, and the child is very difficult. The child screams, the child throws these tantrums because the child's suffering from a chronic case of autism. And so that was never really fully investigated, and what they did was, because they would hear the child screaming while the child was living with the biological parent, they removed the child because there were many calls that were made saying that the child was being abused. And yet the child still continues to exhibit this type of behavior in the foster care parent's home. So, there's a lot of there's a lot of neglect with the system.
Right.
However, I can say that the system, I just completed a training on identifying impending and immediate danger as a mandated reporter. We're mandated to report certain things, but we should be very casual and really investigate before we go about doing those reportings.
Yes, that's one of the key recommendations in the article. I believe that while I'm not challenging the concept of mandatory reporting at this time, because it's very ingrained, I believe that assessment should precede the call. Because once the call gets made, the system is going to rely on the caller, and that person may have not done a thorough assessment. They may have thought, I'm supposed to call, I'm not really sure there's any evidence of abuse, really, but they believe that there's no harm in making the call. And then the misunderstandings can start from there. So yes, I believe you're right about the do a thorough assessment before calling. Don't rely on the system to do it.
Is these hotline calls, for example, they're happening in an atmosphere of high anxiety. Is that getting better or worse? And I'm also wondering who are the forces that drive continued crackdowns and to make it more difficult to get justice?
Okay, so
Or is it that they're not necessarily there, but everybody is so concerned about children that they don't even have to be in the room pushing for
yeah,
crazy
I mean, I think there's this dynamic of really demagoguery is what I would call it. A politician cannot stand up and say, I want to protect parents who are accused of child abuse. I want to make sure that we have fewer calls. Because there's always the kind of hysteria about the one case you're going to miss. If you don't mandate calls. What's missing is that by mandating all these calls, by creating a system where there is no screening that starts first, we're flooding the system. The resources, to thoroughly investigate are not there, and the harms that are happening. So there really isn't a constituency, and because I believe that the families are really disempowered by virtue of the allegations against them. So I think that makes it incumbent on people who are advocates to speak out and to make policy proposals like the ones I'm making, and trying to get politicians to understand that we have to put resources in a different way, to protect people. The constituencies, there's a lot of people who benefit. This is it's an expensive system. I believe there's a constituency within the medical community that wants to be calling the shots, that wants to be in the position of being the expert that the system relies on, to the exclusion of other doctors who may know more. And that's in their interest. They become more powerful within their own sphere. And they've also, that particular group of doctors sort of has become law unto themselves. So the ones that I'm familiar with in Illinois don't have any evaluation system. They report to the judges like them, the judges listen to them, so it becomes a self-reinforcing system that needs more oversight. I don't know if I answered all your questions. Yeah, okay.
I just have a question, because I have a hard time understanding how a service like this, that's supposed to help children get away from danger, is actually inflicting more traumatic distress on families and the children. And there's I don't see any penalty against them when they commit such mistakes, even when there's such sufficient evidence, medical, in this case. I don't understand. Don't they have any criminal, aren't they you know what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say?
That's a good question. Looking more deeply at how do you hold these agencies accountable? We do have a problem because the ways that systems can be held accountable are, through either political activity, media, or litigation. So I've been pursuing the litigation route, but it's very challenging to sue these agencies and hold them accountable. In some states it's easier, and in New York is one of the places where there's been the most successful litigation, and some of my cases have been very successful as well. But it's a very demanding and challenging proposition because our laws are civil. If you study civil rights laws, I mean, there's some doctrines that give immunity from suit to a lot of the people that we're talking about who are doing the bad deeds. So that makes it challenging to hold them accountable.
I would like to piggyback off of what you just shared, because there is accountability. There is, but there's a high double standard that takes place. The accountability only gets imposed or enforced when something really bad or tragic happens, right? Then heads roll. Because we've seen it in New York. We've seen where a child slips through the cracks, ends up dead, and now people get fired, people are held accountable. But it doesn't work when you're talking on the other side of the street.
That's right.
When you're
That's
talking about
yeah.
the injustices that are taking place against families.
Exactly, that's the point.
And
Yeah.
that's where the media shies away, which you so eloquently shared with us today.
Right.
The media doesn't want to put their hands on it unless it's something that's
Right. There have been some really good stories recently in the New York Times, the New Yorker. I mean, it's just been a sea change in the past 2 years of the number of stories that have been presented from the side of the families who are affected. The opioid series that the New York Times just did is really good. But this is, I think, because we are now expanding the availability of counsel, because the lawyers are starting to be the ones like me telling the stories. The parents are really oftentimes unable to do that. I mean, then there's also programs that are taking families who have been through the system and helping support them to become advocates for other families. And I talk about that in the book too, because Mary and Tony, I should have mentioned this in my closing of my talk, Mary and Tony are both board members of a group that I'm the president of to be advocates for families. It's called the Family Justice Resource Center. So I think that is part of the solution, is that the people who are affected need to join together and become advocates for other families.
A few days ago, I was reading an article on the New York Post about 10 children dying under Child Protective Services supervision, and they were high priority cases. So should caseworkers who disregard kids who are actually like being abusers, being reported like multiple times? Should they be held accountable too?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I think it's the same problem. I think it's two sides of the same coin. When children who are abused are not getting proper attention, and because we have a system that kind of, it encourages the most competent caseworkers to leave. The working conditions are bad oftentimes, and the resources available for the kids, and sometimes, they don't go out and see the kids enough if their caseloads are too high. So these problems feed themselves. And if you don't know what child abuse is, I think we have a very unclear understanding, even the caseworkers, in terms of, identifying serious abuse versus, something that shouldn't be treated as abuse at all. So I think these problems feed together. But yes, anybody who, I also believe that it's not always clear. That you don't always know, if the child is going to be in danger. I don't think we can create an algorithm that's going to tell us, which child is going to be seriously injured by their caregiver. But there can be a lot of red flags.
Do you think the risk of separating the child from the parents is worth it to maximize the safety of the child during an investigation?
No. I think that we ought to understand that you're causing enormous harm from the separation unless you have real evidence of immediate, serious harm to the child. I'm in favor of a much higher standard for removing children.
Okay, but to jump on that, like the situation where the child fell when the 7-year-old was watching, don't you think that the parent should be held responsible to a point where the child is separated so they can figure out what the situation is? Because let's say if the child didn't fall, if the parents actually abused the child, wouldn't it be safer to separate the child for some time while they investigate instead of leaving it with the parents?
I think, you're asking if there's genuine, reasonable suspicion of abuse caused by the parents.
If there's injury to the child, should the child be separated while they investigate?
No, because there are many, many injuries to children, and you need a concrete, definite reason to suspect the parents. And here you had the opposite, in fact, because you had the child explaining what happened. So plenty of cases where you don't know. And in cases where you don't know, if there is a real reason to suspect the parent, and there's evidence, and you just we need to decide where the risk of harm should lie. And my view is the state has to have a burden to show it has a reason to act. And that's not just supplied by the fact that there's an accident and injury doesn't do it. It's not enough.
Does a child abuse hotline act on calls that are placed anonymously?
In many states, almost all, they do. And the rates of finding in those cases are 1% to 2%. So they're really low yield calls. And in fact, in some cases, it's considered to be dangerous because they've gone out and not found the right child. And so the group I'm involved in is proposing elimination of anonymous calls.
Have there been any studies about the psychological damage these unfounded accusations cause to parents and children?
No.
Think there should be?
Yes. I would love it. Actually, we looked very hard. We had in the class action I was mentioning, the 13-year-long case, we did have a psychologist who presented testimony about reputational injury and how serious that is. He called it akin to PTSD. And I've seen that too. I've seen parents who just even see a notice that it is somewhat accusatory that has the name Child Protective Services written across, and I've seen them have heart palpitations over just being, having that experience again of being targeted. So yes, would love to have more research. It's a really untapped area.
First, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. It's kind of a morbid question, but if you don't mind answering. The example you gave with the child falling off the couch, if, God forbid, they did, like, if they did die, do you think the parent should be at fault for, like, I guess it would be like negligent homicide?
No, I don't think. I believe that there are accidents and no parent is perfect, and no parent can necessarily put their child in an absolutely safe environment. Injuries, the things sometimes that we think are safer for children, like not being left in a car, for example, while a parent runs an errand, is safer than driving with the parent. So we have gotten some ideas of, how to, protect our children that are actually hurting them more. So no, I don't think, they weren't charged as it was criminally, because criminally, and a lot of cases with the injuries, that's what ends up happening is they might get a finding in the child abuse register, or they might get even a finding that the child was abused, but the system doesn't know by who. And therefore, they'll leave that finding there, but they won't go to criminal court. They won't go to any other court. And it's because they don't have a perpetrator. And in the criminal system, they would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone intended to cause the harm. So a lot of these cases, they're not going to be a criminal case.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you.